Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 50 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Seattle Kraken, in which the Sharks have won 2-0. This marks the Sharks' first shutout victory of the entire season, which for most teams in the NHL, it happened 50 games in, is not very impressive. But for a team that has been as bad as San Jose this season, especially when it comes to just letting in goals and general defensive play, the fact that they even managed a single shutout this season is quite the feat. And with this victory, in combination with the fact that the Sharks have been on a bit of a hot streak as of late, and also that the Chicago Blackhawks have been really bad as of late, the Sharks actually move out of last place spot in the National Hockey League. And while I may say that as a sort of good news situation, it probably is more so bad news, considering the Sharks had seemingly had a lockdown on that last place spot when you consider the fact that they've had an 11 and 12 game losing streak this season. The fact that they now find themselves 2 points above the Chicago Blackhawks in 31st place in the league is quite surprising. And when you also consider the fact that the Blackhawks were the team that had the first overall pick last season, it definitely rubs a bit more salt into the wound here for a San Jose Sharks perspective. It is the ultimate goal by the end of the season to try to have the best possible draft lottery odds. That comes when you are the 32nd place team, and so the Sharks to find themselves 2 points out of that spot is not exactly optimal for most people. But of course, when it comes to the Sharks players and coaching staff and how they feel about it, they've definitely been enjoying these last couple of weeks. Moving on to this actual game, it didn't exactly start off the best way for San Jose. In fact, the first 40 minutes of this one were not remotely all that exciting. The Sharks had just 3 shots on goal through the first half of this one, and that would seem like a crazy stat, and yet it's not even the worst mark that the Sharks have had this season. It was just a few games ago where the Sharks had just 2 shots in the first half of the game, so technically a slight improvement over that. However, once the third period came around, the Sharks definitely did wake up, and even during the first 40 minutes, while definitely Seattle were the better team and were getting more chances, it didn't feel overwhelmingly in favor of the Kraken. Blackwood had to be great, but he didn't have to be world-beating, sort of best game of his career type of style. And so the Sharks did a pretty decent job, outside of a couple of really bad turnovers, of keeping things quite close, and even going into that third period where, like I said, they did start to play, they did start to pile on those shots, and eventually the only manned net goal that would be scored by either team in this game would once again come from Marc-Edouard Vlasic, his 4th of the season, his 4th goal in the last 8 games as he maintains his hot hand. And this is just sometimes when you're on a bit of a hot streak and things just seem to be going your way, you score these types of goals. Vlasic, with just a random shot from the point, happens to seemingly have eyes and just find its way through a maze of bodies, as well as the goaltender, to make it 1-0 San Jose. And they honestly did not really sit back. They weren't having to play on their heels, absorbing tons and tons of pressure from Seattle. They kept things relatively stable, and of course the Kraken, they got their chances here or there, but the Sharks locked it down quite well. And in particular, when it came down to the 6-on-5 type of situation, sure, the Kraken, they did have the zone time, but it was kept mostly to the perimeter by the Sharks' 5 defenders, as they didn't allow too many chances in tight. Any chance that was coming from the point was usually blocked or perhaps just sent wide, and eventually it was Jan Ruda with the spinning empty net goal with 20 seconds to go who would make it 2-0 and put this game away. This also, very interestingly, marks the second straight game in which the only 2 goal scorers for the San Jose Sharks were Vlasic and Ruda. And if you had told me that that would even happen for a single game this season, I probably wouldn't have believed you. So the fact that it has happened twice in a row, and actually just a couple of games ago they did the same thing a third time, is pretty impressive. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the top line of Zetterlund and Hoffman being joined today by Logan Couture. This is because Tomas Hertl did not dress for the game here tonight. In the similar situation to Henry Thrun that I talked about in the previous game, Hertl sustained an injury in the second period against the Buffalo Sabres, would return for the rest of that game, but if there is some sort of nagging issue here, there is literally zero reason to play him for the last couple of games prior to the All-Star break / bye week that the Sharks will see 2 straight weeks off with 0 NHL hockey games happening. Since the Sharks have no actual goal for the end of the season when it comes to making the playoffs, there's no reason to risk any sort of aggravated injury, and so Hertl does sit out, and it is Couture who fills in on this top line. Now this didn't necessarily look like it was going to work super well. While Couture has been okay enough defensively over these few games that he has played ever since returning from that very long injury, from an offensive perspective, he hasn't been all that great. And when you consider the very little chemistry that these three players are likely to have, considering Hoffman is an entirely new face on the Sharks this season, and while Zetterlund did play 20 or so games last year, he didn't play too much with Logan Couture, if at all. And so these three players are essentially just three randoms put on the ice at the same exact time. And while I do think they did serve the Sharks pretty well defensively, offensively, there was essentially nothing doing here between these three players. Like, they had individually a couple of okay looks, but when it came to coming together as a trio, there was nothing here. And so while we may see this as a trio next game as well, because Hertl is likely not to return until post All-Star break, I wouldn't necessarily expect too many big things from them. Then we have the Sharks' second line, as it is Duclair and Barabanov being joined by William Eklund at center here. Now, it was expected that if Hertl was going to be injured, maybe it would be Nico Sturm getting bumped up to the second line. Perhaps, as we have seen multiple times this season, Luke Cunnin would move to center and he would get bumped up. But instead, the Sharks decide to go with William Eklund. Now, this is definitely a surprise, but interestingly enough, it should be noted that William Eklund was drafted as a center originally back in 2021. And while the old Sharks brass wanted to ease him into the NHL as a winger, their ultimate goal for Eklund was for him to eventually become a centerman at the NHL level. Now, under the new Mike Greer regime, we do not know if that's exactly still the sort of career path that they're hoping for from William Eklund. He has been just playing the wing the entire time thus far this season until this particular game, but it was definitely an interesting showcase for him. As a centerman, you're going to be skating a lot more, having to come back slightly more defensively. You're also going to be taking all the face-offs. Eklund did those things admirably, I would say. I mean, he was already quite solid defensively, so there was no necessary change of pace there. He always gives that extra effort on all of his shifts that he plays, and on the face-off, he was decent enough, I guess you could say, here tonight. Definitely some work to still be done, but it's not as though he lost every single one that he took. And honestly, Eklund was probably the Sharks' best forward on the night for the second straight game, as he was a huge part of why the San Jose Sharks managed to even get a singular goal here tonight. As when you watch this Mark-Edouard Vlasic, while the assist itself wasn't super impressive, the fact that he was the single-handedly carrying this into the zone, weaving through multiple Seattle Kraken players to get this zone time, get this established, and then work it up to the point to Emberson and eventually to Vlasic for the goal was very, very impressive. And when you combine this with the fact that both Barabanov and Duclair did very little to actually help out Eklund here, Eklund elevating the two of them for sure, as I thought Barabanov ended up having a decent enough game, but Duclair kind of was quite invisible, as he has been multiple times this season, and so it was essentially just the William Eklund show on the second line, and he did such a fantastic job. It's been very nice to watch Eklund over these last few games because he's been so good for San Jose in any role that David Quinn has been playing him in. When he got bumped down to the third line, when he got jumped up to that first line halfway through that game, now on to the second line here, it's just been working out for him time and time again, even despite his line mates not always having the best of games with him. Then we have the third line of Sturm, Cunnin, and it is Jacob McDonald who we see returning to the lineup for the San Jose Sharks. And we see here that this third line that had been quite good over these past few games was primarily benefiting from the fact that William Eklund was driving it forward, because with the departure of Eklund, this was perhaps the Sharks' worst line of the night. Yes, the first line did very little offensively, but at least they were somewhat responsible defensively in their own zone. Zetterlund had some solid back checks. Couture, covered things quite well. For the third line, on the other hand, that was not exactly the case. They were definitely a step behind defensively on a game that most players looked quite good for the San Jose Sharks. Offensively, there was like one or two chances here, in particular for Luke Cunnin. He came like relatively close to scoring, but otherwise it definitely felt as though this third line was absolutely missing the presence of William Eklund that they had in those past couple of games, and clearly Jacob McDonald is no replacement for number 72. And then when it comes to the fourth line, the only line actually tonight that was kept the same from the previous game, Bailey, Carpenter, and Zadina, and they continued to work relatively relatively well for San Jose. Zadina actually had a couple of close calls there. I believe it was in the second period. Some decent shots. If he had like a bit of a better look, maybe he could have even beat the Kraken goaltender at that point. Bailey showcased some okay speed, but not necessarily a ton of offensive zone time. And Carpenter was decent. Generally, I would say the fourth line was positive for San Jose, but not by all that much of a margin. And then we have the defensive side for the Sharks. Top pairing, I guess you could say, is once again Vlasic and Emberson, though if you take a look at ice time, it seems more so to be Ruda and Mukhamadullin. But we'll start with Vlasic and Emberson because defensively, these two players were very good. Vlasic continues his resurgence in his career. Not only does he manage to add the game-winning goal here tonight, the only goal on the man net, as I mentioned, but defensively, he was still very, very solid. And it's one of those types of games where you're like, you didn't exactly notice Vlasic a ton, but in the positive sense, not in the usual negative sense like it was in the beginning of the season. Vlasic has just been so steady for San Jose as of late, and we can only hope that this type of performance continues. With Ty Emberson as well, he also looked quite good. There was that kind of disastrous giveaway near the end of the second period that led to a bit of a scramble in the Sharks' own zone, but besides that, he also put up a really solid game. Then we take a look at the second pairing, which, as I said, is maybe more so like the first pairing because of the ice time here, of Ruda and Mukhamadullin. Let us, of course, start off with Mukhamadullin, who had an up-and-down game in his debut against the Buffalo Sabres. I talked a bit of the pros and cons of his performance that night. Here tonight, it should be mentioned, by the way, that Mukhamadullin eclipses the 22-minute mark on the night, and he was actually getting the sort of 6-on-5 defensive zone shifts at the end of the game, which shows an immense amount of confidence instilled into him by David Quinn. As I've mentioned in the past, it is quite interesting to watch how David Quinn treats his rookie forwards compared to his rookie defensemen. Rookie forwards seem to be able to do no right and just get benched at the first sign of a even slight mistake that you would see from anybody else, and yet a rookie defenseman, even if they're not necessarily playing outstandingly, will be getting these types of shifts to try and really sort of throw them into the deep end here and see how they do at the NHL level. Now, when it comes to Mukhamadullin, this is not to say that he was not having a good game. In fact, I actually thought it was a lot steadier than the previous one against Buffalo. While he isn't necessarily as effective at an offensive perspective here tonight, he had like one decent move in the neutral zone that got the Sharks possession in the offensive zone. But besides that, there weren't like tons of shot attempts or anything of that nature. But defensively, he kept things solid. He kept things under control. He did a very good job in the 6-on-5 situation. He had good defensive positioning, which was something that I was somewhat critical of him in the previous one, and so I was definitely happy to see how Mukhamadullin performed. We will likely get one more showcase from him in tomorrow's game against the Anaheim Ducks before he will almost certainly be sent back down to the Barracuda, but of course, you never know what David Quinn will decide to do with him. And when it comes to his defensive partner, Jan Ruda, also a very effective game for Ruda. He was definitely even a step above Mukhamadullin. He had a couple of issues, but it should also still be noted that he is, of course, facing off against the top competition from the Seattle Kraken, so it's not always going to come exceptionally easy to him, but I thought even when he made those mistakes, he recovered very, very well and generally had a good game. And then finally, we have the bottom pairing for the Sharks, as Okhotyuk was actually joined by Kalen Addison, who steps back into the lineup in favor of Kyle Burroughs. I don't know if that is an injury or just a personnel choice, but that is indeed the case that the Sharks ran with. And I will note that while I have obviously not been a big fan of Kalen Addison at all this season, I have been quite hard on him thus far this season, I do think he actually put up a pretty good performance here tonight. Nothing that blew me away. Offensively, I thought he started off with a couple of good shifts and then kind of just fell off a cliff and really didn't do all that much. The Sharks' one power play that they got here, he was actually on that first power play unit, and I thought he did okay, but generally, while the Sharks had the zone time on the power play, they didn't actually make anything happen from it. But I do say Kalen Addison was definitely a positive performer for San Jose. When it comes to his defensive partner, Okhotyuk, things were slightly more shaky. Okhotyuk, while generally in the grand scheme of things, I thought he actually played pretty well, there were, as per usual for Okhotyuk, just multiple huge errors in his defensive zone. I mean, just to take a look at, I believe it was in the first period where Okhotyuk literally passes it straight to Brandon Tanev, who had the opportunity to make it 1-0 relatively early on into this game, and who knows what type of game we would have had that shot actually gone in. And these are just the type of boneheaded mistakes that Ochotsk has a tendency to make, and yet he continues to maintain a spot in the lineup, which goes back to the point that I talked about with David Quinn, where he's so much harder on the rookie forwards than he is on the rookie defensemen, who are given a lot of leeway. And then we finally have the goaltender for the Sharks, Mackenzie Blackwood, and as I mentioned earlier on, he didn't have to, have the best game of his career, but he did have to be really good to keep the Kraken to 0 goals here tonight and maintain the Sharks' first shutout victory of the season. Great performance from Blackwood, really, really good look for him. Obviously, he's not going to get the next one because tomorrow is another game and it's a back-to-back type of situation, and there's no reason to try and sort of tire him out in that way, but a nice ending for him prior to the big All-Star / bye week. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow, where they will take on the Anaheim Ducks, a team that they actually beat just a couple of weeks ago. It is the final game before the very, very long break for San Jose. It is also the next team up from the Sharks in the standings. The Sharks sit at 32 points. The Anaheim Ducks have 36. So this is a pretty important 4-point game from a San Jose Sharks perspective, considering that they probably want to lose this one. Class dismissed.